There is a fantasy almost every human being on this planet has had at least once, maybe more than once, maybe more times than you would like to admit. The fantasy of watching someone who hurt you, someone who betrayed you, humiliated you, used you, discarded you, finally get exactly what they deserve. Not just getting it in a way they cannot deny, in a way that is visible, in a way where they know, in the moment it arrives, that the universe has balanced the ledger. You have thought about this. You have probably planned versions of it in your head during the quiet hours, during the drive home, during the 3 in the morning moments when sleep will not come because the injustice of what happened to you is still sitting on your chest like something with weight. And here is the thing that no one wants to say out loud in polite company. It does not feel wrong to want this. It feels completely, entirely justified, because psychologically it is. The desire for revenge is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of immaturity or spiritual failure or emotional damage. It is one of the most deeply wired drives in the entire human nervous system. And today we are going into exactly why. The neuroscience, the evolutionary psychology, the social mechanics, and the dark, complicated truth about what revenge actually gives us and what it quietly takes away. This is one of the most honest conversations about human nature you are going to hear. And by the end of it, you are going to understand yourself and the people around you in ways that will permanently change how you read every conflict, every betrayal, and every act of justice you witness for the rest of your life. Let us start at the beginning, not the philosophical beginning, the biological one, because the desire for revenge does not originate in your values or your upbringing or your personality type. It originates in your brain, specifically in a cluster of neural structures that evolved hundreds of thousands of years before modern civilization existed, before law courts, before social contracts, before the concept of forgiveness was ever articulated by any philosophy or religion. The desire for revenge is ancient, and it is ancient because it was necessary. In the environment where human beings evolved, small bands of hunter-gatherers living in close proximity, entirely dependent on social cooperation for survival, being wronged without response was not just emotionally painful, it was genuinely dangerous. If someone in your group took your food, stole your resources, betrayed your trust, or harmed someone you were bonded to, and you did nothing, you sent a signal to everyone watching. You signaled that you were safe to exploit, that there would be no cost attached to harming you. And in an environment where social standing directly determined access to resources, mates, protection, and survival, that signal could be fatal. Retaliation was not aggression, it was communication. It was a public broadcast to every member of your social group that you had a threshold, that crossing it had consequences, and that the cost of wronging you was real. The individuals who had this drive, who felt the pull toward retaliation when wronged, survived and reproduced at higher rates than those who did not, because their social position was defended, because they were not repeatedly exploited. And so the drive was selected for, generation after generation, until it became baked into the standard operating architecture of the human mind. You are not broken for wanting revenge. You are exactly what evolution designed. Now let us talk about what actually happens in your brain when you contemplate revenge, because this is where the conversation gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely dark at the same time. In a landmark study published in the journal Science, researchers used neuroimaging to observe brain activity in participants who had been cheated by a partner in an economic game. They then gave those participants the opportunity to punish the person who cheated them at a cost to themselves. They chose to punish, and as they did, the researchers observed activation in a very specific brain region, the caudate nucleus, which is a core component of the brain's reward circuitry. The same system that lights up for food, for money, for sex, for social praise, lit up for revenge. The brain does not distinguish at the reward processing level between something good and punishing someone who wronged you. Both feel like winning. Both release dopamine. Both produce the neurochemical signature of satisfaction and pleasure. This is not metaphorical. This is not a figure of speech when people say revenge is sweet. It is literal. The brain treats the act of retaliation against someone who hurt you as a genuine reward, as something worth planning, worth the cost of obtaining. And this is why the fantasy of revenge is so persistent and so detailed. Your brain is running a reward simulation. It is pre-experiencing the dopamine release that would accompany the real event. Every time you imagine the moment of reckoning in detail, every time you construct the scene where they finally face the consequence, you are feeding your reward system a preview of a meal it desperately wants. And like every other dopamine-driven craving, the preview sharpens the appetite rather than satisfying it. But there is more happening than just reward activation. There is something that operates on an even deeper level, something that psychologists call the justice motive. Human beings have a fundamental, cross-cultural need to believe that the world is fair, that actions have consequences, that good and bad eventually meet their appropriate outcomes. This need is so deep that psychologists have documented it in children as young as 12 months old, infants who prefer the puppet that helped another puppet over the puppet that hindered it. The sense of fairness, of moral balance, of cosmic ledger-keeping is not taught. It is built in. And when someone wrongs you, when someone behaves badly toward you and faces no consequence, it does not just create anger. It creates a specific, agonizing kind of cognitive dissonance. Your brain has a model of how the world should operate: cause and effect, action and consequence, harm and accountability, and the reality of unaddressed injustice violates that model. The wrongdoer is still out there, unchanged, unpunished, possibly thriving. The world has failed to correct itself, and your nervous system will not rest until either the correction happens or you find a way to mentally close the ledger some other way. Revenge, in this context, is not cruelty. It is restoration. It is the psyche's attempt to repair the broken model of moral order and return to a state where the world makes sense again. This is why revenge fantasies feel righteous rather than guilty, because at the neurological and psychological level, they feel like justice, not like aggression. The distinction your nervous system makes between the two is almost. Now let us talk about the social dimension, because revenge is never really a private act, even when no one is watching. One of the most consistently documented findings in the social psychology of revenge is that it is fundamentally about communication. Specifically, it is about communicating your value and the cost of your devaluation to an audience, sometimes a literal external audience, sometimes the internal audience of your own self-regard. When someone wrongs you, they have made an implicit statement about what they think you are worth. They have said through there that the cost of harming you is acceptable, that you can be lied to, stolen from, betrayed, humiliated, discarded, and that the risk is low enough to be worth taking. Revenge is the rebuttal. It is the counter-statement. It is the proof that the cost was not as low as they calculated. And this is why revenge feels most urgent when the wrong was public, when others saw the humiliation, the betrayal, the dismissal, because the wrongdoer has made a public statement about your worth, and leaving it unanswered means allowing that statement to stand as the final word. The revenge impulse says that is not the final word, and at the most primitive level of social cognition, it is entirely correct. The research on deterrence in both human and animal social groups consistently shows that a willingness to retaliate, even at cost to oneself, changes how group members treat you going forward. The person who responds to wrongdoing with nothing is wronged again. The person who responds becomes protected by their own demonstrated willingness to respond. The reputation for retaliation is itself a form of social armor. So when you feel the pull toward revenge, part of what you are feeling is your social brain doing extremely rational calculations about your long-term standing, your self-protective reputation, and the message that silence sends to everyone who witnessed the original wrong. Here is where we go into the territory that is most psychologically complex and most personally useful. The feeling of revenge satisfaction and the reality of revenge satisfaction are two entirely different things, and the gap between them is one of the most painful and least discussed experiences in human psychology. The brain's reward system is fundamentally a prediction system. It does not just respond to outcomes, it responds to predicted outcomes. And the prediction of revenge, the fantasy of it, the planning of it, the anticipation of it, is almost always more satisfying than the reality. This is because the fantasy is perfect. In the fantasy, they are fully exposed. They feel the full weight of what they did. There is no ambiguity, no alternative narrative, no way for them to dismiss or reframe what is happening. The ledger is balanced in the exact way your psyche needs it to be balanced. But reality is not a fantasy. In reality, the person who wronged you may not react the way you imagined. They may feel no remorse. They may spin it, deny it, make themselves the victim. They may face consequence, but experience it as external bad luck rather than as the direct result of their toward you. The moral clarity of the fantasy almost never survives contact with the messiness of reality. And multiple studies have confirmed this. People who were given the opportunity to retaliate against someone who wronged them reported, in the aftermath, not the relief and satisfaction they had anticipated, but a continuation or even intensification of their negative feelings. Because when you take the revenge, you also lose the fantasy of taking it. The thing your brain has been pre-experiencing as the solution turns out not to be the solution. And now you have neither the fantasy nor the peace. You are left with the reality of what you did, what they did, and the fact that the wound is still there. This is one of the cruelest tricks the reward system plays. It sells you a destination and delivers a different address. There is a concept in psychology called the empathy gap, the documented human inability to accurately predict how we will feel in a future emotional state that differs from our current one. When you are in the acute pain of being wronged, when the humiliation or betrayal or loss is fresh and loud and consuming, your brain cannot accurately model how you will feel in a state of peace. It can only model solutions from the current state. And from the state of acute pain and injustice, revenge looks like relief. It looks like the answer. The empathy gap prevents you from accessing the knowledge that a future version of you, healed, restored, rebuilt, would not need the revenge the way the current version does. The future you that has moved through the pain and rebuilt their life would look at the revenge that felt so urgent and see it for what it often actually is, not resolution, but a leash. A way of staying tethered to the person who hurt you long after the wound itself would have healed naturally. Every hour you spend planning, anticipating, and executing revenge is an hour your attention, energy, and cognitive resources are directed toward the person who wronged you. You are giving them your best thinking. You are centering your life around them. You are letting the injury define your agenda. And this is the darkest paradox at the heart of the revenge psychology. The thing that is designed to restore your power is often the very mechanism that keeps you powerless. Not because wanting it is wrong, but because it chains you to the source of your pain at exactly the moment when distance is the only thing that would actually heal you. Let us talk about what the research says about the relationship between revenge and self-respect, because this is where the psychology becomes genuinely practical rather than purely theoretical. One of the most consistent findings across the psychology of revenge and justice-seeking is that the need for external revenge is almost always inversely proportional to the level of internal self-validation available to the person. Put differently, the more secure you are in your own sense of worth, the less urgency you feel to have the wrongdoer publicly, externally, visibly punished. This is not because secure people feel less pain. They feel the same pain. It is because their sense of value is not entirely dependent on external correction of the record. They can hold the knowledge of what was done to them, feel its injustice fully, and still not require the public reckoning to know, internally, privately, immovably, that they were wronged, that they did not deserve it, and that their worth was never actually diminished by the of the person who treated them as though it was. The revenge impulse, at its most desperate and consuming, is often a signal that the wound touched something deeper than the specific incident, that it activated an older, pre-existing uncertainty about one's own value, one's own deservingness, one's own right to be treated with care. The external revenge feels necessary because the internal restoration feels impossible. If I could just see them pay, then I would know it was real. Then I would know I mattered. Then I would know the world saw what happened and agreed with my version. But the external reckoning is a borrowed answer to an internal question, and borrowed answers never quite fit. Now here is something the dark psychology of revenge reveals about human social structures that most people have never explicitly articulated, but have always intuitively understood. Revenge is a form of social signaling that operates on a completely different frequency than verbal communication. You can tell someone you are fine with words. You can say you have moved on, you forgive them. It no longer affects you. But you're when given the opportunity to retaliate, communicate something that words simply cannot carry. There is a reason that cultures across all of human history, from ancient legal codes to modern film narratives, have assigned deep meaning and even to acts of retaliation. The willingness to avenge a wrong to a family member, to oneself, to community, has been treated as a moral virtue, not a vice, in the overwhelming majority of human cultural history. The idea that revenge is primitive or morally inferior is a relatively recent cultural development, largely driven by organized religions and legal systems that sought to transfer the administration of justice from individuals and clans to centralized authority. The modern legal system is, in a very real sense, institutionalized revenge, a social mechanism for delivering consequences to wrongdoers in a way that satisfies the collective justice motive without the destabilizing cascade of private retaliation chains. When the legal system fails, when the wrongdoer faces no consequence, when the institutional apparatus cannot or will not correct the imbalance, the private revenge impulse surges back with a force that is almost irresistible. Because the brain's justice system does not accept procedural explanations, it registers only whether the balance has been corrected. And if the institution does not correct it, the individual feels the biological pressure to correct it themselves. Let us talk about the type of revenge that the psychology of human consistently identifies as the most satisfying and most sustainable, because not all revenge is equal, and the research draws a distinction that changes everything. Psychologists separate what they call hot revenge from what they call cold or delayed revenge, and then separately from what they call success as revenge. Hot revenge, the immediate, emotionally flooded retaliation in the heat of the injury, consistently produces the least satisfaction and the most collateral damage. It is reactive rather than chosen. It satisfies the acute impulse, but frequently creates new problems, new regrets, new narrative leverage for the person who wronged you to recast themselves as your victim. Cold revenge, the planned, deliberate, calculated delivery of consequence at a time and in a manner of your choosing, produces higher satisfaction ratings in self-report studies, largely because the planning itself is part of the reward experience, and because the deliberateness of it feels more like agency than reaction. But the type of revenge that the research identifies as producing the deepest, most durable, and most genuinely restorative satisfaction is something that technically falls outside the traditional definition of revenge at all. It is the deliberate, intentional construction of a life so good, so full, so unbothered by the person who wronged you that your flourishing itself becomes the answer. Not performed flourishing, not the kind where you are constantly checking whether they can see how well you are doing. Genuine, private, internally anchored thriving that requires absolutely nothing from their awareness or to be real. This is the version that heals rather than just satisfies. This is the version that closes the wound rather than picking at it while inflicting a different one. The reason it works is not poetic or spiritual, it is neurological. When you invest your attention and energy in building something rather than dismantling someone, your reward system begins to associate its activation with creation rather than retaliation. You stop needing the external reckoning because the internal landscape has been rebuilt. You stop the wrongdoer's punishment because their presence in your mental world has shrunk to a size that no longer requires a response. Here is the final piece, and it is the one that ties everything together in a way that is genuinely useful rather than just intellectually interesting. The psychology of revenge teaches us something profound and uncomfortable about the nature of pain, power, and the stories we tell ourselves about justice. When you are in the grip of the revenge impulse, when it is loud and consuming and feels like the only rational response to what happened, what you are actually experiencing is a very specific kind of powerlessness. The powerlessness of having been acted upon without consent, of having had your narrative by someone else's choices, of having stood in a situation where you did not control the outcome. The revenge fantasy is your mind's attempt to reclaim control, to rewrite the end of the story in a way where you are not the one who was left holding the damage. And this impulse deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed. It is not pettiness. It is your psyche fighting for its own restoration. But here is what the psychology of revenge ultimately reveals about the path to actual freedom from what was done to you. The control you are seeking through the revenge fantasy is real. The need for it is valid. But the only version of control that cannot be taken away, cannot be denied, cannot be reframed by the person who wronged you is the control you rebuild internally, over your own narrative, over your own attention, over your own definition of what your life is going to mean from this point forward. Every person who has ever wronged you handed you something along with the wound. They handed you information about who they are, about what you were willing to tolerate, about where your life needed a different direction than the one it was on. The revenge that actually satisfies, not for a day, not for the duration of the dopamine spike, but permanently, is the one where you take that information and build something with it that would not have existed without the wound, where the injury becomes the material rather than just the event, where what they did becomes, in the fullness of time, one of the most clarifying and redirecting things that ever happened to you, not because it was okay, not because it should have happened, not because forgiveness is required or healing is linear or any of the comfortable platitudes apply, but because you decided, deliberately, privately, as an act of reclaimed agency, that the last word in this story is going to be written by you. And it is going to be written in a life that makes the betrayal look small. That is the revenge that the psychology of human nature, the neuroscience of the reward system, and the deepest research on justice and recovery all point toward. It does not require them to see it. It does not require them to know it. It does not require their suffering or their public reckoning. It requires only that you decide, fully, irreversibly, without performance, that you are done letting what they did be the loudest thing in your life. And the moment that decision becomes real, the fantasy loses its grip. Not because you have forgiven, but because you have reclaimed something they were never actually entitled to take, your future. And with it, the only revenge that was ever actually worth having.